What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV, and it's time to do another video in the installment of ranking the Chicago Bulls teams of the 1990s, the championship teams. And number 6, I had the 98 Chicago Bulls. At number 5, I had the 93 Bulls. At number 4, I had the 1997 Chicago Bulls. And at number 3, I have the inaugural championship team, the 1990-91 Chicago Bulls. And like I said, once you get past the lower two teams, it can be argumentative about where you want to rank, these teams. As a matter of fact, I was not arguing, but having a discussion with a friend of mine, and he thought that the weakest championship team was the 93 team. He thought I should have had the 93 Bulls ranked last. And I can understand that argument, but I even remember Michael Jordan saying after the Bulls won their last title that he thought the 98 team was the least talented overall. The 1991 season, I can't say there was a surprise that the Bulls won a title, but back then, the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan were looked at far differently than they would be looked at toward the end of their last championship in '98. Go all the way back to the beginning of that season, all eyes were probably still on Detroit. Detroit had just repeated as NBA champions. All right, they were only at that time the second team since Bill Russell's Celtics in the 1960s to repeat. Of course, Magic Johnson and the LA Lakers repeated in '87 and '88. And now you have a team that swept the Lakers in '89 in the playoffs, albeit Magic Johnson and Byron Scott didn't play in that final series, pretty much. And then they beat the Portland Trailblazers in 5. Portland was seen as a rising, contending team in the Western Conference, and they beat them in 5 games. So everyone's looking at Detroit as the rising the rising new dynasty in the NBA. There are a lot of teams, of course, that did not like the Detroit Pistons style of play. One of the loudest opponents of the Detroit Pistons, of course, were the Chicago Bulls. But if people have been paying attention to the Chicago Bulls, they would have been noticing that Chicago had been steadily improving for years. In fact, they took the Detroit Pistons all the way to 7 games in the 1990 Eastern Conference Finals. Luck would assist the Chicago Bulls in this season, though. It has to be said that luck did help them out in the first year. And of course, this perceived luck was an argument against the Chicago Bulls until they repeated and three-peated, and then people said, okay, this is a real championship team. The Detroit Pistons started off great in 90-91. Great record. But what happened, and Isaiah Thomas has talked about this, in preparation for the 90-91 season, he did a lot of practicing, working on his game, working on his jump shot. Working on his jump shot, however, caused an injury to his wrist, which, had he not had surgery on it, according to a physician, it could have been a career-ending type of injury. This caused him to miss a multitude of games. I think he only played 48 games or something like that in the 90-91 season. This kind of derailed the Pistons. Another thing that people tend to say is that the Detroit Pistons were starting to get old. I have issues with that argument. My issue with that argument is that if you look at the Detroit roster, for instance, now James Edwards was getting older. James Edwards at that time was Buddha, probably about 34, 35 years old. Okay. But Isaiah Thomas coming into that season, wasn't 30 years old yet. All right, Joe Dumars was still in his 20s. Dennis Rodman had not quite turned 30. Bill Laimbeer was in his early 30s, like 32, 33 years old coming into that season. I think it was 33. All right. Whereas you compared them to the 98 Bulls, all right, Michael Jordan was 34 going on 35. Scottie Pippen was 32 going on 33. Dennis Rodman was 36 going on 37. All right. There were many people on that team, Chicago Bulls, that were past 30 years old. So the age argument, that's just an excuse. But it did derail the Detroit Pistons injuries, and they finished with a 50-32 overall record. And it just didn't look as dominating that year as they had the last couple of several seasons. One surprise team in 1991 was the Boston Celtics. The Boston Celtics had not really been a dominating team since probably '87 when they made it all the way to the NBA Finals. Um, that year they got off to a very good start. I think at one point in time they had the best record in the NBA. I think it was like 27-5 or something like that. They had an awesome record. But what happened was um, Larry Bird started having issues with his back. His back was, I mean, he had always had issues with his back since he hurt it in the mid 80s. But this was the time when his back really started. It was to the point where eventually it would end his career. So the Bulls did kind of benefit a little bit from injuries. The Bulls got off to a slow start that year, uh, but they quickly established themselves as the best overall team and the most consistent team during the 90-91 season. What we really saw too was the continual emergence of Scottie Pippen. Now, the year before that, Scottie Pippen had been an All-Star. Um, in 1991, he was not an All-Star. I can't remember all of the All-Stars that year, but partially one of the reasons why he might not have been an All-Star was the emergence, the reemergence and the renaissance of Bernard King, who was a small forward, who at that time was playing for the then Washington Bullets. I remember Bernard had like averaging like 28 points per game that particular season. But Scottie Pippen was continually to show was continuing to show the evolution in his overall game. The year when he was an All Star, which was the year before, Scottie averaged 16.5 points, 6.7 rebounds, 5.4 assists, 2.6 steals, shot 49% from the floor, 25% from 3-point range. In 1991, he improved all those numbers across the board, averaging 17.8 points, 7.3 rebounds, 6.2 assists, 2.4 steals, shot 52% from the floor, and 31% from 3-point range. So he improved all across the board. In fact, there was a game that year, I'll never forget it. I mentioned it with Chris Jr. in the comment section, where Scottie Pippen had a career high uh, of 43 points, and he shot 16 of 17 from the floor. Um, that will remain his career high until he had that 47-point game against the Denver Nuggets. I think it was February of 1997. Scottie's never been a guy that was a volume scorer. That wasn't his game. Um, Generally speaking, Scottie's not the type of guy to take more than 25 shots in a game. A lot of shots for Scottie is 20 shots. So Scottie was more comfortable being a guy that run the offense, being a facilitator. If he's taking a lot of shots, then something is stagnant in the offense. Other guys just aren't making shots, and therefore he has to step up offensively and go into that role. Um, but the Chicago Bulls finished the regular season with a 61-21 overall record. Michael Jordan won his fifth consecutive scoring title, averaging 31.5 points per game. I think he didn't lead the NBA in steals that year. He might have been second or third. I believe Alvin Robinson led the NBA in steals that year, but he averaged 2.7 steals per game. Don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think he averaged like better than 6 rebounds and maybe close to 6 assists that year, or something like that. Horace Grant was Horace Grant. Uh, you know, Bill Cartwright had a good year, but Bill Cartwright, that was probably the last year that Bill was uh, at the adequate to not adequate. What do I want to say? I think that was the last year he was an above average center in the league. After that, age and attrition began to catch up with him. And I think 1991 was the last year that John Paxson was John Paxson. Overall, from an athletic standpoint, 1991 is probably the best year for the Bulls. Michael Jordan was still Air Jordan. 91, 92, Jordan was still Air Jordan. But you can see he was taking a little bit more jumpers in 91, 92. He was still Air Jordan, but 1991 he was Air Jordan. He was still come fly with me, Mike. Although he no longer was dominating the basketball, was playing more off the ball. And one other thing I remember about that year is he still was having friction. He was 90% sold on the triangle offense, but there was still flashes of the older Jordan or younger Jordan where he kind of still cared about numbers to an extent. Um, I remember that year he didn't have a 50-point game. And I remember reading the book, The Jordan Rules, where it was a game against the Seattle Supersonics, where Jordan was heavily motivated to school uh, Gary Payton. Gary Payton had run off at the mouth at Michael Jordan, supposedly. I think this was Gary's rookie year, I believe it was his rookie year. And he basically told Michael Jordan he could shut him down. And there was a game, I think, where he had 46 points. And I believe it might have been like early in the fourth quarter. Like he was well on his way to a 50-point game. And then Phil Jackson took him out. And I remember Michael reportedly was complaining about this guy's not going to let me get 50 this year. But Michael Jordan, by the late 90s, didn't care about his numbers anymore. He cared only about championships and winning basketball games. Um, During the playoffs, the Chicago Bulls were their most dominant. Even though I think that there were two teams that were arguably better than this team, in the postseason, I think you could make the argument that the 91 Bulls was the most dominant of all six NBA championship teams. They made short work of the New York Knicks in the first round of the playoffs, 3-0. Of course, this is when the first round was still best of five. In that series, of course, is the dunk. The dunk that most people remember is the dunk where Jordan was being double teamed. I think it was by John Starks and Charles Oakley. And somehow Jordan freed himself going baseline and rising up and dunking over Patrick Ewing. I mean, it's one of the most iconic dunks of all time. Probably two of the greatest dunks ever by uh, Chicago Bulls. The victim was Patrick Ewing. The other one being the dunk on Patrick Ewing by Scottie Pippen. Um, During the next round, they played in the Eastern Conference semifinals. They played the Philadelphia 76ers, and they made short work of them. And then in the Eastern Conference finals, they played against their foe, the Detroit Pistons. There was This was a heavily anticipated matchup. Many people just felt like at that time the Detroit Pistons just had the Chicago Bulls number. Um, what some people thought was, well, look, last year the Chicago Bulls not having home court advantage, having won, I think they won 55 games in 90. Uh, Detroit had won 59. Detroit had home court advantage. They won 7 games. So to many Chicago Bulls fans, they felt like if they had home court advantage, that would give them the key to the series to be able to beat them. But nobody was expecting a sweep. Um, Not only was it a sweep, this series was not even really competitive. It was not a very overly competitive series. And the Detroit Pistons were frankly embarrassed by being swept by the Chicago Bulls, a team that they probably still felt was inferior to them. But that was the case no longer. And in a moment that I think the Chicago Bulls, especially Scottie Pippen and Michael Jordan, felt overshadowed their moment of triumph, the Detroit Pistons infamously walked off the court without congratulating the Chicago Bulls and before time expired. And that that move, which apparently was concocted by Bill Laimbeer and Isaiah Thomas, was seen as classless and spiteful, and was almost universally, outside Detroit Piston fans, was universally panned uh, by basketball fans, NBA fans, and sports analysts. I also think that move probably solidified Isaiah Thomas uh, not being on that dream team. I know it hurt Isaiah Thomas, and I think that did it. Yeah, Isaiah Thomas was supposedly behind the freeze out of Jordan 85. Yeah, we all know Isaiah Thomas was the ringleader of the bad boy Pistons, and behind that smile was a cold-blooded killer who did, what I'm saying, who did a lot of fucked up shit. Well, when I say cold-blooded killer, I'm not talking about Jeffrey Dahmer or a fucking serial killer here. I'm talking about in basketball terminology. But I think that singular act, I think that had a lot to do with him not being on Dream Team. But onward to the NBA Finals, and the Chicago Bulls would face the Los Angeles Lakers, led by Magic Johnson and James Worthy. But this was a different team than the Showtime Lakers. This was a revamped Lakers squad. This team was a more half court, slower tempo team, but it had worked. They had upsetted the Portland, well, mal upset. They upset the Portland Trailblazers in the Western Conference Finals. And it's interesting that they did upset Portland, because had the Chicago Bulls played Portland, Portland would have had home court advantage because they won 63 games. Lakers, I believe, won 58 games that year. But the Lakers were no joke. And coming into that series, there were many people who felt like the Lakers had a better than average or better than modest shot of beating the Chicago Bulls. You got to understand that at this time, the argument for the Lakers was Magic Johnson. This would have been his 9th NBA Finals. He had the experience. Look what he done in the playoffs. Look what he led this team to do. All right. The Chicago Bulls are great, but they have no NBA final experience. All right. They're young. Maybe the Bulls aren't ready yet. All right. And most people at the time would not bet against Magic Johnson. All right. He was the ultimate winner. Magic was going for his 6th title. At that time, an argument against Michael Jordan was, well, a scoring champion can't win NBA champ. A scoring champion can't be an NBA champion. All right. At that time, the only time we had seen that was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in 1970-71, who was still Lou Alcindor. And people say, well, look, but he also had Oscar Robertson. Um, And after game one, there were more believers that Magic Johnson was the better player and was on his way to a sixth NBA championship. The Chicago Bulls lost at home by the final score of 93-91 off a last second near last seconds Sam Perkins 3-pointer. Michael Jordan missed what would have been the tying shot near the end of regulation, which would have sent the game to overtime. It was the first time Chicago lost at home in the entire postseason, only the second time they lost in the playoffs. The other loss being against the Philadelphia 76ers. And once again, Jordan's detractors had talking points. He can't, look, Magic Johnson's Magic, and the Lakers are a seasoned veteran team, and for the most part. And the Lakers, they just have too much experience. And Chicago, maybe next year they'll be able to do it. Even though it was only the first game of the series. But in game two, Chicago blew out the Lakers, and Chicago set a shooting percentage record that would stand for over 20 years, I believe. And John Paxson shot 8 for 8 in that game. And also, this was the game two, where Michael Jordan had the move, the switch of hands layup. And Chicago evened the series at 1 apiece. And then slowly but surely, Chicago also made a change. They had Michael Jordan guarding Magic Johnson, but then they switched and put Scottie Pippen on him. And Scottie Pippen, being 6'7", close to 6'8", with the the length that he has, it gave Magic some problems. And ultimately, Chicago took control of this series and won it in 4. I remember reading about, and watching the game too, but reading about in detail as I got older, how Phil Jackson had to get in Michael Jordan's face in game 5 of the series, where he was telling Michael essentially, look, trust your teammates. And, he started passing him to John Paxson. He was like, who's open, Michael? And Michael wouldn't say anything. He's like, who's open? And then he said, well, John Paxson was like, well, give him a damn ball. And John Paxson shot 9-12 from the floor in that game. And I believe Scottie Pippen scored 30 points. Michael scored 32 points. And the Chicago Bulls won their first ever NBA championship. During the NBA Finals, John Paxson was phenomenal. John Paxson averaged 13 points per game, which is well above his norm for that particular season. He shot 65%. Scottie Pippen had an awesome series. He averaged, I think, 20.8 points per game. I think something like close to 7 rebounds. No, I think it was 9 rebounds. I think he averaged like 6 assists. He shot, I believe, 57% from the floor in that series. Michael Jordan had one of the great all-time NBA Finals. He shot 56% from the floor, averaged 31.2 points. I think it was 6.6 rebounds and 11.4 assists. And those were people that said all Michael Jordan did was shoot the basketball. In fact, going into Game 5, he actually had a higher assist average in the finals than Magic. Magic eclipsed him by, I think, having like close to 20 assists or something like that, or 20 assists in Game 5. But Michael Jordan had one of the great all-time series, and the Chicago Bulls finally won their NBA championship. They finally learned how to fly. And that's it, man. That's how I look at this team, the 90-91 Chicago Bulls. And Phil Jackson also received a just due claim that that he was deserved for his claim as one of the great coaches in the NBA, and he would go on to become seen as arguably the greatest coach of all time, definitely the most successful. All right.